In our understanding of the Union Executive, when we come across the powers and functions of the President, we understand them in various categories: executive powers, legislative powers, financial powers, judicial powers, diplomatic powers, military powers, emergency powers. What exactly this infers is Constitution under various provisions has explicitly mentioned the extents of powers of the President, and to a great extent has also come across defining the functions of the President. As we have already observed, President's office is quite crucial, quite important. And very importantly, President performs a very distinct legislative function. Rather, he causes the entire legislative business to either begin or end. So, President's office is the most functional for the running of legislature as well as the executive. Now, the interconnectedness between the President's office, the role, the power of the President with his executive powers, and the role of Council of Ministers is very important. So, this is where we understand the intricacies of Article 53 and its correlation with Article 74. Now, Article 53 very distinctly refers to executive power of the President. And further, the power that is vested with the President is exercised either directly or through officers subordinate to the President's office and in accordance with the Constitution. So, officers subordinate to him is a very important interconnectedness. So, the reference of Article 74. Now, Union Council of Ministers with Prime Minister at the head, the way we have discussed earlier, exists to aid and advise the President. And this is very explicitly mentioned in the Constitution that such kind of assistance is in the exercise of his functions act in accordance with such advice. The most important aspect that we should remember as far as this advice concept is concerned is the President is indirectly elected. Prime Minister and his Council of Ministers are directly elected. We have legislative supremacy in our parliamentary system of democracy and functioning. Now, what happened in the 42nd Amendment to the Constitution in 1976 was the advice to the President by the Council of Ministers is binding. This was asserted. But later, in the 44th Amendment of 1978 to the Indian Constitution, a smaller change was basically made. But what we should remember is the legislative supremacy was kept intact. It was not taken away. Rather, simple understanding is advice shall be binding, right? But the President can for once and only once send back a few advices in the form of recommendation. But the second time the Council of Ministers advises back the President, then that advice is binding to the President. And very importantly, Article 74, Clause 2 distinctly refers that the question whether any, and if so, what advice was tendered by minister to the President shall not be inquired into any court. Now, all this means is the de facto head is the Prime Minister, because the very sincere reply should be directly elected that the Prime Minister is, rather being the member of legislature, has the upper hold or the legislative supremacy. And although all the executive decisions are in the name of the president, but the real policy maker, the real implementer, the real content and the intent is by the Prime Minister and his Council of Ministers. Now, the reason why I reiterated all of this content is, when we discussed about term of office of the president, we specifically referred to Article 56, Clause B. That is, the president may, for violation of the Constitution, be removed from office by impeachment in the manner provided in Article 61. Now, Article 61 speaks about the procedure for impeachment of the president. We will deal that separately. But the reference of Article 56, Clause B, where distinctly it has been mentioned that there shall be a provision for impeachment of the president if there is violation of the Constitution. Now, correlating this with Article 53 and 74, now Article 53 requires the president to perform his executive functions. 1. Article 74 requires the Prime Minister and his Council of Ministers, rather the entire executive, to advise the president for his executive businesses. 2. And this entire advice is binding on the president. 3. Now, if there is any violation of the Constitution, what exactly it means is, if the president denies or if he does not accept the advice of the Council of Ministers, the executive, then it amounts to violation of Constitution of India. It clearly means that president is not doing the constitutional duty of the president to accept the advice. Now, this is where we come across the interrelation between the president and the Prime Minister's office, or rather, how exactly, being the head of the state, rather conducting all the businesses of the executive machinery on behalf of the president, how exactly the president and the Prime Minister are related. What kind of a relation exists between the president and Prime Minister? When there is a provision for the president to advise back the Council of Ministers in the form of consideration or reconsideration of the advice, when he sends back any of it, what exactly does that mean? It means that there exists a definite relation between the president and the Prime Minister. There exists an equation. Now here, to a great extent, although the advice of the Executive Council of Ministers is binding on the president, although that is very true, but the space for the philosophical dimension, the space for ethical dimension, the space for a friendly suggestion, a space for wisdom, a space for advice has been given in the Constitution. The way we referred it in the 44th Amendment, a possible reconsideration of the advice can be sent to the Council of Ministers, can be sent back to them by the President. In the simplest form, what we should understand is, yes, it is binding for the President if the advice is returned back on the second occasion of the same advice. Yes, it is binding, but that period when President sends back the advice of the Council of Ministers, that period is meant for that wisdom to count upon. Meaning that the office of the president is not merely ceremonial. It is not merely the work of a stamp. But indeed, if the president feels that the decision, or rather the advice by the Council of Ministers, isn't fair completely, or has to be reconsidered, rather than isn't fair, has to be reconsidered, then president for all purposes can use his comfort of wisdom, can use his space of philosophical angle, can use his office, his position of being the first citizen, and send back. Now the procedural part, that the Council of Ministers, if they send back the advice, then it is mandatory for the president to accept it. That is the procedure part. But if at all it was compulsory, then why at all was this space given? That is what we have to think about. The space was given to substantiate the position of the president, that in his capacity, if he feels that the Council of Ministers need to rethink and if needed make changes to their advice, then that is where he differs. In the sense, he has that space. Now, since we have clearly understood that there is no conflict of interests between the position of the president and the position of the prime minister, there is nothing called who is superior here, because it is very well clearly established by the way of election itself that the president is elected indirectly and the prime minister is elected directly. Since there is no conflict of interests, and it is very, very simple that we abide by the legislative supremacy of the parliamentary system that we follow, yes, it is the president's office which enjoys that additional space of wisdom, of philosophical bend, and under that discretion, the president has been given a decked position of being a friend, a philosopher, a guide to the prime minister.